I'm Peter Levine, the director of the Defense Management Institute, and we're here today as a part of a planned series of interviews with individuals who have made a significant contribution to improving the management of the Department of Defense. Today, we're speaking with Terry Gerton, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Academy of Public Administration. NAPA is a congressionally chartered nonprofit organization that brings together the country's leading experts in public management in an effort to improve governance at the federal, state, and local levels. Before joining NAPA, Ms. Gerton completed a 20-year career in the Army and spent 12 years in the senior executive service, much of it at the Department of Defense. It is no exaggeration to say that Terry has devoted her life to public service. Terry, welcome, and we're glad to have you here.
Peter, I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So Terry, let me just start at the beginning of your career. You started in the Army, in the military, at a time when there were really very few women in the military and far fewer in leadership positions. Can you tell me how you decided on West Point and a military career way back then?
Well, it's not as if it was a life plan. I will tell you the truth. It's all my mother's fault. Anyone who has high schoolers knows in the junior and senior year, like the mailbox fills up with college information. And when I was a junior and a senior, that the service academies were just beginning to admit women. So I kept getting all kinds of information from all the service academies, which I promptly threw in the trash, which my mother, unbeknownst to me, got out and filled out all of the response forms. And so here I was, 16, 17 years old, having no idea what I wanted to do. And my mother was sending back all of the responses to the service academies. So sort of to make a long story short, I got invited to take the PT test, which you had to do in person. And I was like, how did that happen? I went and took it. And if you know anything about the Service Academy PT test, it's not any skill that you would naturally have. And so I didn't do very well. But I thought I had passed. And when I got a note back, it said that I hadn't. So I called West Point specifically and said, I think my score is wrong. And this was like in November of my senior year of high school. And they very politely said, we'll look into it. Well, at that point, they were doing an early admissions board, and they pulled my folder to look at, corrected my PT score, and offered me early admission in January of my senior year in high school. I hadn't filled out a single other college application. So I thought, well, okay, sure. Why not? It's free. If I hate it, I'll quit. And if I finish it, at least I've got a job. I don't know what else I'll do. So I accepted my offer of admission.
What was it like going to West Point at that time, as again, one of the few women in your class, I presume, and
Right.
in an environment that was very different, I'm guessing, from where you were in high school?
Very different. So I was in the fourth class of women to matriculate. I will certainly say West Point at the time was still very much trying to figure out what to do with women. And so they kept trying different things. And some of them worked and some of them didn't. But my class to this day has the fewest number of female graduates of any class ever. So there was a lot that I had no experience in. But after being there, certainly left with incredible friendships and support. You just don't realize how much you need other people to help you through, I think, until you really do need it. But it is a real cradle of leadership training. You don't realize you're being trained in it until you leave and you have to deploy those skill sets. And so I've never regretted it. I almost quit, but I didn't. My parents drove me back one summer. But it's turned out to be, sort of the ultimate fork in the road in terms of my life choices.
You moved into a career in maintenance and logistics, is that right?
That's right. I was an ordnance officer, maintenance officer, which I also knew very little about, except that my fiance was in the engineers. And I thought, well, if I pick ordnance, it's likely that there's a maintenance unit wherever there's an engineer unit. That's how much thought I gave it. But again, the skills and the practice of being a maintenance officer taught me at the very core customer service. Because in the military, of course, the maintenance units are in direct support of the fighting units. And so as a first lieutenant, so think about being 22, right? I had responsibility for the maintenance operations that supported an infantry brigade. the supply chain, the maintenance chain, all the maintainers, all of the spare parts, ultimately responsible for that brigade's equipment readiness. And as the units got bigger and the responsibilities got bigger, those functions got bigger to the point where when I was 35, I was supporting an entire corps with the maintenance function. And it just stuns me to this day that the Army gives so much responsibility to such young people. But it was an incredible learning experience.
Tell me about what you learned about management in those kinds of positions. What kinds of management challenges did you face, and what kind of lessons did you learn? Is there anything you'd like to share?
Well, I think there's both leadership challenges and management challenges, right? So again, as a maintenance company commander in Germany, when it was still East Germany and West Germany, and we all had, warfighting assignments and missions, I had 320 people in my company at the ripe old age of 25, from one border of West Germany to the other. And thinking about how to keep all of those folks accountable, to keep accountability of all your supplies and equipment, to engage with a brigade that was distributed across that space as well. And to make all of those rounds with a Jeep and a wired phone, because that was the technology of the time. Just learning how to keep everybody on task and on mission, and the importance of reporting accurately, right? There wasn't any room for fudging any of those numbers, right? You had to be accurate and precise. But managerially, the idea of running a maintenance shop, right? Keeping accountability for the equipment, optimizing maintenance, repair, and training cycles, understanding your supply rotations, and keeping track of parts that are on order, parts that are on hand. Just incredible kind of life lessons for so many things.
Did you at that level feel that you were responsible for re-engineering the process, or just for running the process that you inherited?
Oh, definitely not re-engineering. Nobody invited a junior captain to re-engineer. Later on, there were some processes perhaps that I had the opportunity to re-engineer, but trying to optimize, right? Really understanding the parameters and the framework that you were working within, understanding the skills and talents of the people that you had. When I was a company commander in Germany, for example, we were fielding at that time the new M1s and Bradleys, right? So, getting people off of the old M60 tanks and onto the M1s, it's like buying an EV today, right? Completely different. Everything from top to bottom different. All of our maintainers had to go to training. All of the receiving unit had to go to training. We had to switch out all of the stocks. We had to redevise all of the support strategies, and then we had to figure out the tactical support plan for that. So those were some really interesting days.
One of the things people say about bureaucracies is that the people who know what's wrong are not empowered to fix it necessarily. And so you were at a level where you could see if there were things in the process that were just messed up, that maybe you just had to figure out how to make them work because you weren't empowered to change them. Did you see that kind of bureaucracy? Did you experience that kind of frustration?
I will give you an interesting example. So my first assignment was at Fort Ord. So back to being the lieutenant in charge of the maintenance company. In the 2.5 years I was at Fort Ord, the 7th Infantry Division was reorganized 3 times, from heavy to light and back to heavy. And so as they were redoing the tables of organizations and equipment from heavy to light, we were a heavy maintenance company. And the folks who were doing the planning came back, and I remember this distinctly, said to us, you get 7 trucks for the maintenance company because you're going to be a light maintenance company. Well, if you've ever been to a auto repair shop and you've seen the kind of toolkits that auto mechanics have, like the big ones, every single maintainer had a toolkit that size because even the light infantry division still was going to have equipment. And so I had to go to the planners and say, how are we going to get all of our toolkits to the maintenance site? And they said, well, you're going to carry them. I said, no, we're not. We're not going to carry them. So we had to have this big negotiation about how many trucks a light maintenance company could have, because the people were going to walk. This was a light infantry, right? We're going to hike wherever we're going. I said, but we can't carry our toolboxes on our backs. So to a certain degree, I got to re-engineer that process. We wound up with a few more than 7 trucks. But it was a really interesting experience to hear what folks kind of back in Washington at that point thought that we needed on the ground.
So after you completed your career in uniform, you stayed with the Department of Defense in a new role. Can you talk about first, why did you decide to stay? Why did you decide that you wanted to remain in defense? And then, well, then start with that, and we'll talk about a few other aspects of that.
Sure. So I had decided to retire from the military at 20 years. Um, Lots of reasons for that, but definitely was going to retire. And so, of course, as a good military officer, you start planning in advance of that, what you're going to do and where you're going to apply. Um, and there were 2 senior executive vacancies in my organization. So I thought, well, let me find out, right, if I could do that. And actually, the senior leadership invited me to apply for those. And then as I was going through that process, a lot of my peers said, you're only a lieutenant colonel. You can't apply for a senior executive position. And I said, what do you mean you can't? Well, that's just not done. You have to be at least a colonel to apply for those positions. And I thought, well, that's interesting. If you know me well enough, you know that when people tell me I can't do something, it typically means that, well, that's what we're going to try to do then, right? But the wheels of government hiring don't turn any faster now than they did back then. So I had applications in for those 2 senior executive positions, and my retirement date was coming up, and they hadn't been adjudicated. So I actually took a consulting job because, have to keep all your doors open. I took a consulting job with a defense industry consultant, and I had been there 2 weeks. And in 2 weeks, I had figured out that that was definitely the wrong career choice for me. And in 2 weeks, I got called for an interview for the SES position. And at that point, they were able to make a decision pretty quickly. So after 4 weeks in my civilian job, I gave them my 2-week notice, which nobody wants to do. But having sort of dipped my toe in that water, I was 100% sure that I had made the wrong choice. It was like I got a do-over with the SES position. And coming back into DOD in a space I knew, but with an opportunity to take on some new challenges, was just a much better fit.
Tell me then, what aspects of a civilian service did your military career prepare you for, and what aspects required the most learning or change?
So I think in some ways I was very lucky to have spent my last 6 years of active duty in the Pentagon, right? So 3 of them on the Army staff, 3 of them on the OSD staff. So I'd already kind of gotten used to Pentagon operations. I had a civilian wardrobe because in OSD PA&E, they didn't want to know who was military and who was civilian in the room, so we all dressed in civilian attire. I'd been working with senior civilians already and civilian analysts, and so that made it very comfortable. I already knew the missions that I was coming back into, but having the military background and having been on a service staff also meant I had connections and an understanding into the issues that were affecting the military decision makers. And, I think I could say in retrospect, it made me much more effective at my position because I was able to have peer-to-peer conversations with both communities instead of being only on one side or the other.
You mentioned earlier the difference between leadership and management. And obviously, it seems to me that a military education, I could be wrong, you tell me, a military education, a military training is oriented more toward leadership. And that on the civilian side, the emphasis may be more toward management and less on leadership aspects. But I say that without having been through both sides in the way you have on a hands-on basis, and I wonder what your reaction is to that.
I think that's probably fair. I've talked to a lot of folks about federal civilian personnel management and training, and the optimal theories about that always include leadership training that is a natural for the military, and it just never gets called into being and funded on the civilian side. And so I think I would agree with your thesis, right? The military leadership experience and training that I had helped me be a much better senior civilian because I'd been taught things like, how to lead well, how to communicate, how to have a vision and a mission. And then I'd had the opportunity to build up my technical credibility to be a good manager of the projects that I was assigned.
You mentioned earlier that you had the advantage of being able to communicate both with the military and with the civilians. DoD really has a unique organizational structure with both the military structure and the civilian structure side by side and
Right.
overlapping at different points. And I wonder whether you have any insight into how well that works, not your personal relationships across
Sure.
those lines, but the civilian-military relationship across the Department of Defense. Does it add functionality? Are there friction points that are problematic for the department?
That's a really great question. I think, you have to start from the core belief in civilian control of the military, right? That's how we're structured, and that's how we have to organize. But there is tension, and there's challenges in communicating across those two communities. Certainly, I felt very fortunate. I always worked for terrific military folks who were very open to what I had to say and what their civilian counterparts had to say. But I think it can be very difficult for the civilians to understand the command and control structure on the military and the kind of pressures that military leaders feel feel responsible for and that they have to work within. And at the same time, the military, who often don't have much exposure to civilians at all until they get to the Pentagon, right? Um, don't understand that construct and that development channel. So they tend, without intervention, I think, to view the opposite community with some suspicion and some mistrust. But where the two are open to conversation, I think it can be a really powerful partnership. I mean, I think what I learned the most was the idea from my civilian perspective that I was best off if I was totally transparent with my military counterpart to say, this is what I think and why I think, and what I think the pros and cons are to pursuing a particular course of action. Only once did I ever have to offer that they could fire me, um, which I did. But that was key to a breakthrough as well. And to invite the military counterpart to tell you what their key priorities and concerns are. And at that point, the two sides can really bring their best assets to solve the problem. If they're trying to fight or defend against the other, the balance doesn't work.
So the key is recognizing that each side has strengths and taking advantage of the strengths of both.
Absolutely. Strengths and differing incentives, right? I mean, at the end of the day, everybody wants the Department of Defense to be ready to do whatever its missions are called on to do. But inside that, on a day-to-day basis, the motivations can be a little bit different. And so working really hard to build those relationships is important.
One of the stress points I would think is the different rotational policies where civilians are there for the long term because you tend to have a career in an organization, whereas military rotate in and out. I can remember a similar kind of issue arising at a more senior level where the military were there for the long term and senior civilians come through because the politicals come through on a short-term basis.
Right.
And people used to talk about how if there was a leader whose positions they didn't like, the military could wait him out because they figure they're only going to be there for a couple of years anyway. I wonder whether that's a dynamic that you see at the level where you have career civilians looking at military leaders who are rotating in and out. Is that problematic?
I've seen it used both ways, right? To say, you have a very short time frame here. How can I help you make the difference that you want to make, right? And really partner together to try to accelerate the bureaucracy. And I've seen the opposite happen, which is that's a crazy policy. And if we just go really slowly, we'll just kind of wait it out and everybody will be frustrated. There's got to be a happy medium there, right? And I think DOD is in a really good place to do that because they have so many different layers and you have consistency and then you have some change and you have the military and the civilian perspective. If people could approach it with an open mind, there's an opportunity to really be transformative in a fairly short period of time.
One of the challenges you had as an SES, I presume, was working across organizations, that you had to not only manage the people who worked for you, but you had to work with other organizations. The department is notoriously structured in pillars that don't necessarily work well together. Can you talk about the challenges of working within that kind of structure?
I would call it the need for bureaucratic ninja-ness, right? You just, if you've been there long enough and you kind of know how the bureaucracy operates, again, you can use it to your advantage or your disadvantage. But as an example, when I was in my first SES position in what's now CAPE, I was in charge of the DoD programming process, right? That was my job, the FIDIP database and all of its glory, and how DoD kind of goes through its 5-year programming cycle. And one of the great frustrations, and I know you could appreciate this from your time on the Hill, is that DoD's programming and budgeting and execution data doesn't link together, right? So you can program all you want and it's fabulous, but if you want to know how that program actually played out in execution, nobody knows. So I had a really great relationship with my partner in the budget side, who maintained the budget database, and we thought we could figure out how to map the two databases so that we could answer that question, because execution data is in the budget data. And so rather than create new elements, we just created this map. Well, we briefed it to the comptroller, we briefed it to the PA&E, and they said, well, you have to get the services and the defense agencies to agree. So 3 years later, I remember I was in my final briefing around the table. I had all of the service programmers, all of the service budgeters, the defense agencies were there, and the Navy G8 announced that he was leaving. Every single chair pushed back, and that was the end of the conversation. We lost one person just prior to being able to do the final briefing and get consensus, and we lost the entire negotiation. Back to your rotation schedules, right? So it can be incredibly difficult and time-consuming, and no matter how many PPBE commissions you have, no matter how many frustrating briefings on the DoD budget process, it's people and it's complex, and there's nothing necessarily that motivates change. So to my knowledge, they still can't map programming and budgeting.
They couldn't map when I was an OSD, because I had a project where we were looking at service budgets for defense agencies, and we had different categories that were included and excluded. And we came to a solution of how many dollars were going to be assigned to each defense agency. And then we wanted to look at the execution data, and the numbers for each agency were completely different, and they bore no relationship to the first. So yes, it's but you would have solved that problem if they...
I could have. We had an answer. I don't know if it would still apply. Maybe somebody's still got it in a drawer somewhere.
After any other management challenges you'd like to talk about while you're in the department as an SES before I move on?
Well,
other ones yet?
I certainly think, well, I don't know if you'd classify it as management or leadership, but realigning several institutions and agencies within AMC as a result of 2005 BRAC was a real leadership and management challenge. AMC had the largest number of employees of any command affected by BRAC, and we had to consolidate several of our commands into single institutions, and we had to move the headquarters from Fort Belvoir to Huntsville. So we had almost 11,000 employees that were going to have to move. At the end of the day, one measure of effectiveness is we had the highest continuation rate of people who did make moves under BRAC of any of the BRAC-affected organizations. But we were building new headquarters. I still to this day remember trying to imagine what a command center should look like, right? How we should equip a command center in 2010 so that it could still be relevant and meaningful in 2025. Right? Those kinds of questions, the integration across so many PERT diagrams that you had to have like giant conference tables to lay them all out. And so you had this organizational management challenge, but then you had individual people who were making individual decisions. Do I stay? Do I go? Who's going to buy my house? Where are my kids going to go to school? What's going to happen to my commute? Trying to deal with both extremes of that spectrum and make it functional from a mission perspective as well as responsive to individual concerns was an incredible lesson.
Were you there long enough to see it work?
No. I did not go with the Army Material Command headquarters to Huntsville. My last official act with them was locking the door on the last day and turning the keys over to the new occupant. But I have since, from the outside, had the opportunity to engage, and it seems like those transitions ultimately settled in and are working really well.
So after you left the Department of Defense, I gather you were in the private sector for a while, and then you went on to the political appointee position in the Department of Labor. Can you talk about, well, first of all, the difference between working in the Department of Labor and the Department of Defense?
Yes, it took me about 6 months to figure it out. I would say there are two main descriptions that sort of explain how different they are. DoD lives in a self-sufficient bubble. It doesn't have to ask anybody for help. It has everything it needs to do its mission kind of internally. And as a result, to your point earlier, you got to figure out how to work across the bureaucracy inside the department. But very seldom do you have to talk to anybody outside the department, right? Department of Labor has the greatest law enforcement and compliance responsibility of any federal department. Over 200 and some laws that they're responsible for. So as a result, they have more lawyers on staff than any other federal department. So everything that you want to do is slow. It requires department-wide consensus, and the lawyers have to say yes. But even with that, I had to learn very quickly how to navigate outside the department. I mean, I was responsible for veterans employment and training, and I could not do my job if I didn't have functional relationships with the VA, with DoD, with housing, with education, with all of those different kinds of departments. And so that learning to work across federal departments was a radical change for me.
Mm-hmm. And the same kind of frustration where if the N8 decided to leave, that you're, not the N8 in this case, but if somebody decided to leave right when you had everything negotiated, you have to start over?
To some degree, because even though you need department-wide consensus, the different agencies inside the department would go, well, that's not really my job, so I don't care, right? So we were able to do a lot working with our stakeholders outside the department and leveraging the tools that were innate in the Department of Labor and the workforce system. But it was a huge education curve because I didn't know anything about Department of Labor systems. And to this day, I'm like their biggest advocate because the public workforce system is such an amazing resource for people.
Now, you've already talked about being in both military and a career civilian. How did it differ being a political appointee? Sort of a third role that you played within the federal government.
Yeah, that was in some ways different, in some ways not. So it was clear that the political appointees in the Department of Labor are certainly held to their responsibility to implement the policies of the administration. In my case, that wasn't a problem because the administration's policy in my space was to reduce veteran unemployment, which was something I was totally on board with. So I never kind of got crossways with the difference between policy and implementation. But the skills that I had acquired from being in the military and then as a career civilian were also hugely helpful because many of our employees in the Veteran Employment and Training Service were veterans themselves. So it was easy to have that military language to communicate. And our civilian deputy position was vacant, so I was kind of doing both. So it was like one more skill to learn, but the ones I had already were really critical in being successful there.
As you went from military to SES to political, did you ever come to the point where you had to deal with Congress?
Yes.
And where did that come in, and how did that affect your ability to get your job done?
Well, of course, the Veterans Affairs committees and the military service committees were very engaged with us on veterans employment and unemployment. I think in my 3 years, I testified 12 times. I got a little plaque when I left for testifying the most of anybody that had been there. But that was a whole new exposure for me too, kind of, because in DOD really, there are just a handful of people who ever go to testify. So working with committee staff and trying to understand what their issues were and trying to give them the data that would help make good decisions was really a whole new way of thinking for me. And I also began to really appreciate the value of the nonprofits in our space, the veteran service organizations and the advocates for veterans, because they got to testify too. And so one of the issues that we dealt with for the entire 3.5 years I was at Department of Labor was a desire to move the Veterans Employment and Training Service out of DOL and into VA, because people thought we'd get more money, that we would be more naturally a fit over there. And I think in 3.5 years, I was able to convince them then that that was a bad idea. But I wasn't able to do that by myself. I needed to convince the advocates that the reason we were so effective was because in DOL, we had access to the entire national workforce system, right? And that was the place that we really could help veterans get connected to employment and employment opportunities. And so we did that through intentional communication. We built data systems to show what we were doing with how we were bringing down veterans' bringing down veterans' unemployment, and really building a case with our advocacy population that we were doing a great job and that to move us would actually be more disruptive. But understanding all of those dynamics and figuring out how best to satisfy them was like there's no course for that. You just kind of have to learn. You get thrown in the middle of it and try to figure it out.
So across a career in federal government in all these different roles, you worked with, I'm sure, an incredible variety of different leaders. Can you talk about what you see as making a good leader? What kind of qualities contribute to effective leadership?
I think there are a couple of things that the led want from their leaders. They want transparency. They want commitment. They want protection. And they want to know that you have a vision for that organization, right? And I think it's really challenging for a lot of people to be open and transparent with the people that they lead. But I've always found that that was like the key to being successful, to tell the folks who are working with you what you're doing, why you're doing it, how they play a role, and then reporting back on it. I think the biggest important characteristic for leaders is fearlessness. I see so many people today worried about who will say something or what will show up in the social media or the regular media. And in my own case, I can only testify for my own case, I would say I was best when I didn't care, right? When like, okay, if they fire me, they fire me, but I'm going to do what I believe is right. And communicate that to your people and then protect them, right? If something did blow up, I was prepared for it to be on me and not on them.
One of the things that I see in the department from time to time is a failure to decide, not making a decision. And sometimes that could be a result of what you're talking about, which is sort of a fear of getting out there. Sometimes it's probably more the need to work across many, many pillars and get different people to agree. I don't know if you have a feeling as to, I mean, I think we're too far on the not making decisions side myself in the Department of Defense, but I don't know if you have a feeling about that from your.
I mean, I've been away from the department for a long time, so I shouldn't speak about what I haven't observed, but not making a decision is making a decision, right? And there are so many urgent issues facing federal government today that if we don't push for decisions, we're in danger of the gears just sort of getting stuck. So I think it's incumbent upon leaders at every level to understand what they are responsible for and do their very best to move that agenda forward. Sometimes it is slow, but there's oftentimes resources you can bring to help speed that up.
As you moved up in government from a lieutenant to Deputy Assistant Secretary?
Yes.
Is that right? Your position in the hierarchy of needing to negotiate everything out and being able to make your decision yourself changed. Did your perspective as to the need to get everybody on board or most people on board change, or was there still the same need to have everybody on board before a decision could go through?
I think that depends, but it would. Let me say this: I never had a decision that I never had to make a decision that was life or death urgent, right? That I had to go out on a limb for and say, I got to decide by midnight tonight. There was always time to have conversations. I would certainly say that the more people you have on board, the smoother your implementation is going to be, right? If everybody kind of agrees up front that that's the right course, then as you lay out the plan and the implementation, it's going to take less time to bring them on board, and you will hopefully have fewer defections as you move forward. And the programs you put in place will last longer if people agree up front. So sometimes you are in a position where you really have to make your decision unilaterally. I really never had to do it, and so I tried not to do it.
When I had the opportunity to be in leadership positions in the Department of Defense, I would find myself in a position of when I had to work with a bunch of people across different pillars and didn't necessarily have the ability to tell them yes or no. My tendency, though, would be to telegraph, this is my position, this is where I'd like to come out,
Right.
and I will work with you, tell me what's wrong with that, tell me how you want to adjust it, as opposed to going in and saying, well, we're going to negotiate this out, this is a blank slate. I wonder whether you have a thought as to where on that spectrum you would have been in terms of sort of trying to shape the battlefield versus accepting all the different positions and letting chips fall where they may.
I think, and I'll use the veterans employment issue as an example. We had done some forensics, like to figure out where the big obstacles were. We all agreed that the objective was to figure out how to reduce veteran unemployment. But what I ultimately found most successful was to approach each of my counterparts and say, what's the problem that you have to solve, right? To get to this solution. Because we sort of all agreed about what the optimal solution would look like, but everyone's path to that was different. And so what I tried to do was help people solve whatever their biggest problem was to be able to get to closure. So if it was recognition, sure, you can be first in the roster. That's not a problem. If it was funding, it was like, well, where do we find the funds for that? If it was regulations, we'd look to see where we could make regulatory changes. Trying to be the problem solver that removed the obstacles to consensus was sort of where I found my niche.
Since you left federal service over the last 7 years, you've been the president and chief executive officer of NAPA.
Yep.
Can you describe what the National Academy of Public Administration is and how it seeks to contribute to improved public administration?
I love that question. Thank you for asking it. The National Academy of Public Administration is one of only 2 congressionally chartered national academies, which I think is pretty cool. The other one being the National Academy of Sciences, which was chartered in about 1864 or 5, I think. The National Academy of Public Administration was founded in 1967 and chartered in 1984. So we're written into statute, we're created in statute, but we are a 501c3. We're not a government entity, and we don't receive government appropriations. But our charter requires us to do a number of things, but the core of that is to help government organizations at all levels solve their most pressing public management and public administration challenges. The statutory language included some provisions, but the simplest way for me to think about it is it's kind of a 3-part organization. It is a membership organization. We have about 1,000 fellows. You are one, I am one. People who've had really extraordinary careers in public administration at the federal, state, or local level, or people who have had a career in academia around public administration. So we're a membership organization for our 1,000 fellows. We are partly a think tank because that congressional charter calls on us to foresee the future challenges in public administration and propose solutions to them. So we have a think tank function. And then we have a consulting function where we actually work with government agencies in a variety of mechanisms to help them address and resolve these public management and public administration challenges, some of which we've been talking about today. So it's a fascinating organization with a really interesting and compelling mission.
So you have a staff, and I think from a government perspective, we all understand a staff is a resource you can use. You
Right.
also have these 1,000 fellows you mentioned. How do you harness the knowledge and energy of fellows who don't work for you?
That's right.
Who anything they do presumably is going to be on a volunteer basis. How do you take advantage of all that they know and can do?
Well, we are blessed to have this resource because the knowledge and the skills and the perspective of these fellows really is the secret sauce for how the Academy operates. We try to give fellows a wide variety of participation opportunities. So within our consulting function, if we can go back to that, all of our studies with government agencies are overseen by a panel of fellows. They provide the strategic direction to the research staff from NAPA. They provide the oversight of the study function, and then they own the report, the recommendations, our reports of the panel of fellows. So that's kind of like the pinnacle of how they get involved, and they bring that expertise directly then to the government agencies that we support. We have standing panels of fellows that organize around topics, and these have been pretty long-standing, but we have panels on the public service, on social equity and leadership, on international affairs, on technology leadership, on executive organization management, and international affairs. So those are groups where fellows self-organize and explore research opportunities or other sort of thought leader activities around those topics, and we share those out with the public administration community. We have opportunities for fellows to write op-eds and blogs, to write papers. We will amplify through regular media the productions of any of our fellows. So there's lots of ways for fellows to get engaged and stay engaged and have an impact on what the Academy does.
One thing you haven't mentioned is your grand challenges. And those started about the same time you started. I don't know whether they were your idea, but they're an innovation at least that seems to coincide with your tenure. So can you talk about the grand challenges are a set of critical issues facing the nation in which public administration can play a role in helping solve. Can you tell me how the NAPA came to the grand challenges?
I can. They were under my tenure. So we were working with the board to create a new strategic plan for the Academy in the 2017-18 timeframe. And what we realized was that NAPA had been, up until that time, kind of a responsive organization, right? If someone had come to us and asked a question, we would happily answer it, but we didn't have any sort of agenda that we were driving. And to the credit of the board, they said, we've got to have something that's going to sustain us, diversify our revenue, give us reach into communities we don't actually reach into much, and have meaning. So we came up with this idea of creating grand challenges in public administration. What we said was these should be major issues for the next decade, right? We took some, we modeled them somewhat after the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We said this is something that should motivate an agenda within the field of public administration for the next decade, subjects at which public administration is the center of the solution set. You could pick a million grand challenges. We could have just adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, but those aren't all public administration challenges. And then what we did was we crowdsourced. In 2018, we put out questions. We went to the university, public administration, faculty. We used our fellows network. We went through good government groups, and we said, what do you think is a grand challenge in public administration? And we got back amazing and amazingly thoughtful suggestions. We then had a steering committee that met a couple of times to kind of cull that all down and mush it together and resort it. And we came up with 12. And they're divided into 4 categories: protecting democracy, social and economic development, environmental sustainability, and technological challenges. And what's fascinating to me now is to look at them after COVID. So we put them out in 2019. We said, here's our agenda. Um, and looking at them after COVID, we thought, we were pretty smart. But that process yielded some that we didn't anticipate. As an example, there's a grand challenge to manage water systems. And you think about that and you go, water systems? In 2018, we weren't thinking about water necessarily. We are certainly thinking about water now. And we thought about water a lot differently during COVID when you needed water to sanitize and disinfect, and you had communities across the country that didn't have access to safe and clean drinking water. And now we have, the issues with lead in the water pipes. And so the systems themselves are fascinating. Their vulnerability to cyber hacking is massive and critical. And the fact that water districts are a sub-government level in public administration is something most people don't appreciate. So if you want a grand challenge in public administration, getting a handle on our national approach to managing safe, clean drinking water is a great example.
Taking that example perhaps, but you can take any example you want, once you've chosen providing safe water and providing water as a grand challenge, how do you go about making a contribution to how we will deal with that as a nation?
So we have several ways we collect content and recommendations around that. So we use our standing panels. Many of them align exactly with the grand challenge. Not one of them aligns with water. So that's a difficult one to promote. But we've also built partnerships with a number of local government organizations, with folks like the Council on State Governments, with the National Conference on State Legislatures, with the National Association of Counties, right? To dig into the issues that government administrators, especially at state and local levels, are facing, and try to pull folks together to identify where folks have promising practices, where folks have challenges and capacity challenges. One of the interesting features now of I think the solution set around water systems is the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, I think is where it's at, but billions of dollars to renovate and retrofit local water systems. Well, not every community that needs access to those funds knows how to get access to those funds or has the capacity to go through the grant application process. So there's all kinds of public administration options that we're exploring in terms of grants management and simplification and braiding of funds across different grant programs, and just capacity building from the lowest levels of community government to make sure that we have access to those funds. And once you get those funds, you have the project management skills to see them through.
As you develop solutions, you have a market for them? You have people who, you have a way to reach the people who need those solutions?
We do. And again, it's back through those partners, those associations in the good government space, those advocacy organizations at different levels. There are national associations of water systems managers. And, so there's all kinds of ways to get that out through our own website. But we work hard to push those kinds of products out to the communities that need them the most.
You said these were challenges that you originally envisioned as over a 10-year period. We're getting close to halfway through. So that leads to two questions. One is, how do you plan to evaluate progress on these things that these challenges that you set out? Do you have thoughts as to what you'll look at to determine whether you've made a contribution or what kind of contribution you made? Is that part of the plan?
That's a really great question, and it gets back to your bureaucracy question, right? In our amazing federal system of government, it's very difficult to know how small government organizations are moving forward. We are looking at things like, have we changed the nature of the conversation, right? And in some of these areas we have, for sure. Are we connected with organizations who are adopting our recommendations, and do we start to see them take up our recommendations? And in many of these, we are seeing that happen. I think the next step is to say, can we identify communities where practices are changing? And one of the things that we found very interesting is some communities, we've worked really closely with Baltimore County as an example. They wanted to integrate the grand challenges into their county strategic plan. And so we worked with them over about a 6-month period, and it was transformative. right? Giving folks at the county level sort of a bigger picture of some of the issues that they're dealing with, and then helping them develop measurement and metrics to measure how they would personalize that grand challenge in their community and how it transformed how they thought about the solution set. So it's really encouraging. It is sort of community by community when you get to that part, but every place where we see progress is something that, is really encouraging.
And one other question about grand challenges, which is, at what point do you start thinking about the next stage? Are there going to be new grand challenges? Are there going to be follow-on phases for the same grand challenges? Is this something you've started to think about?
Only tangentially, because we thought initially at about the 5-year point that we would need to do some revisions, right? We thought maybe one of these isn't going to catch on, maybe one of these will be solved, right? Well, from the time we put them in place in 2019, we had COVID, which sort of slowed everything down. And I think, we're just now kind of getting back to where the flywheel of conversations on grand challenges is turning pretty regularly. So I do think, as we get toward the end of the decade, there will be an opportunity to say, did something show up that we didn't forecast, that we need to add in? Is one of these overcome, or solved, and we don't really need to focus on it anymore? I would just say, having lived through the pandemic and seeing all of them play out, but not in the way we originally anticipated, that I think they're pretty durable.
One of the challenges that is particularly important to me personally is the call to modernize and reinvigorate public service. This is not something, this issue is not new to NAPA. You have the reports you've had, the no time to wait reports on public service in the 21st century. What's your view of where we stand and what the major challenges we have facing public service in our country today? Or was that too big of a question?
It's a system that was designed for the 1950s, right? And it's extraordinarily difficult to move. I think the no time to wait papers, which were written in 2017 and 2018, still hold real promise. I mean, they had 3 core principles. One was mission first, which simply said means that your human capital strategy should be an outcome of your organizational mission, and that the mission of the Department of Transportation and the mission of the Department of Education are very different. We ought to think about how their human capital strategies relate to their mission, not just to some regulation about how you can and can't bring people on. Principles always was the second tenet, and that meant that actually the merit principles are valuable and we need to uphold them, but there's different ways to interpret those merit principles, and we ought to be open to modernizing our interpretation of them, and accountability to both, which was one way of saying not every bit of the human capital strategy across the federal government needs to be one size fits all. We ought to be comfortable, the Office of Personnel Management ought to be comfortable, Congress ought to be comfortable with giving agencies the flexibility that they need to develop human capital strategies to meet their mission if they are also then accountable to merit principles.
I would say that every administration, and sort of in my career in public service, which goes back to the Reagan administration, every administration has at least nominally been in favor of those principles that you just talked about, been in favor of modernizing the civil service system, making sure that it can serve the purposes it's intended to serve. How would you grade our progress? And I'm not just, you can grade a progress since 2017 when No Time to Wait came out, but I would say over the time. I mean, we've added some
Yes.
flexibility to the system. How are we doing?
So let's look at the upside first. In addition to the No Time to Wait papers, you were the chair of the panel of the study that we did with the Office of Personnel Management, really looking at its missions and its functions and how it could be the human capital hub that it was envisioned to be. I think we've made really great progress there. I am delighted to know and be told from Director Ahuja that report is required reading for every new person that comes into OPM, and that many of our recommendations have become part of OPM's strategic plan. They're budgeting for them, they're implementing them, they are reporting on them. So there's real progress there. But we continue to struggle with job descriptions. There's no job description for data scientists. There's no job description around AI. The job descriptions are very inflexible. The pay tables are very inflexible. There's a preference for compliance as opposed to a preference for mission accomplishment. And so I think fundamentally the focus of the civilian personnel system remains compliance to the 1960s version of Title V, if you will. And there's still a lot of discomfort about federalizing, for lack of a better word, decentralizing human capital management out to agencies to let them do the things that they want to do.
That compliance mindset is something that you hear a lot with regard to the personnel system. And I had a background working with the acquisition system before I turned to the personnel system. And one thing, people who talk about the acquisition system talk about a compliance approach versus a problem-solving approach. That the best managers in the acquisition system are the people who recognize the rules and look for ways to solve problems within that rule set rather than just applying the rules. I assume that the same thing, that same dichotomy applies within the personnel system, where if you have a problem-solving mindset, you can make a lot of progress even within the existing set of rules. Is that fair?
I think that description applies to sort of every problem set out there in the federal government, right? Some of the things we talked about early in this conversation about understanding the bureaucracy, knowing where the levers of change are, being willing to ask forgiveness instead of permission, right? A leader who comes to the job with that perspective is going to be able to make change and make progress in their own little space. Maybe they can influence outside their bubble. And I think it's true in acquisition, it's true in civilian personnel management, it's true in technology procurement and certifications, it's true in facilities management, right? You know, do you want to convert to LEED standards or not? You know, do you have a requirement to do it? Maybe not, but could you? Yes. You know, if you can figure out how to put the pieces together. So kind of back to your question about what makes a good leader, I think certainly in these issues where there's sort of systematic pipe clogging, you can unclog your portion of the pipe if you're creative in your solution sets.
Let me just ask you a few more questions to wrap up. You've been very generous with your time. With regard to NAPA studies, you know, you do, I'm guessing, about 10 or 12 a year, I think. Are there any that are particular favorites of yours that you'd like to just call attention to?
You know, I think it's really interesting to look back at the history of where NAPA's been engaged. If you didn't know, if you hadn't perused our website at length, you might not know that NAPA was at the table in the development and construction of the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11. Thinking about how should you organize that? How should you structure it? What capacities does it need? What permissions and authorities does it need from a public administration perspective to be successful? I think that's really cool. They were also at the table in the mid-2000s when the FBI was going through a lot of scrutiny and re-engineering and thinking about how best to organize that function, right, to be successful. More recently, I think there's, you know, we mentioned OPM, and I really believe that study has been influential and will continue to be. But we were engaged a couple of years ago with the Office of the National Cyber Director, helping them think through a national cyber workforce strategy, not just for the government, but for the country, and are now back working with them to develop the implementation strategies with their constituencies for how does the nation think about growing the next generation of folks with cyber skills. So we're in kind of all sorts of strange corners of the government and what we do. But the impact of the work has shown to last for decades, which is really encouraging.
You've been, as I said, president and CEO of NAPA for 7 years. That's given you a lot of exposure to these management issues at all stages, how public administration works, great minds in academia and across government. Are there things that you've learned from your post-government career that you wish you'd known back when you were in government?
You know, the thing I I learned when I was out of government that I wish I'd known when I was in was the importance of your private sector counterparts. I always found when I was inside the government fence that talking to the private sector was frowned upon, right? Danger, danger. You could get ethics issues. You could run afoul of acquisition rules. They're just here to take advantage of us. I mean, sort of get scared from talking to the private sector. And what I learned in my time in consulting was the private sector doesn't understand the government either. The decisions that people make inside the government look really weird to the people who are in the private sector. And if we could break that boundary down to have more collaborative conversations, I think both sides would be better off. The government can't work without its private sector and its nonprofit sector partners, right? And if we could find a way to leverage those conversations and to share that expertise, I think we'd all be better off.
So last question. If you were advising a young Terry Gerton or a young person just coming into public service now, starting a career in public service at some level, coming into a management position of some kind, what advice would you give?
First of all, take it, right? One of the things that someone told me early on was you'll never get an opportunity to make decisions at scale at the level you have in the federal government. And it's very true. I mean, there's lots of days when you want to beat your head against your desk, but the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of your fellow citizens is so huge. And the experience of making that difference is so compelling that you don't want to miss that chance. Could you make more money somewhere else? Maybe, but the job satisfaction is just remarkable.
Perfect note to end on. Thank you, Terry.
Thank you, Peter.
That was wonderful. Thank you.